Κυρίες και κύριοι, αγαπητοί συνεργάτες, αγαπητά μέλη, φίλες και φίλοι του Ελληνοαμερικανικού Εμπορικού Επιμελητηρίου. Σας καλωσορίζω στη σημερινή μας εκδήλωση, αφιερωμένη στις εξελίξεις της διατλαντικής οικονομίας και στο ρόλο που μπορεί και πρέπει να διαδραματίσει η Ελλάδα στο νέο περιβάλλον. Η σημερινή συζήτηση πραγματοποιείται σε μια, χωρίς αμφιβολία, ιδιαίτερη κρίσιμη συγκυρία. Η διατλαντική οικονομική σχέση επαναξιολογείται μέσα σε ένα περιβάλλον αυξημένης γεωπολιτικής αβεβαιότητας, αλλαγών στο διεθνές εμπόριο, αναδιάταξης των αλυσίδων εφοδιασμού και ταχύτατου τεχνολογικού μετασχηματισμού. Οι εξελίξεις αυτές επηρεάζουν τον τρόπο με τον οποίο τα κράτη διαμορφώνουν στρατηγικές σημασίες, επιδιώκουν να ενισχύσουν την ανθεκτικότητά τους και επανατοποθετούνται στο παγκόσμιο οικονομικό χάρτη. Η ενεργειακή αυτονομία και μετάβαση, η τεχνητή νοημοσύνη, η ψηφιακή οικονομία και η ανάγκη για ασφαλέστερες εφοδιαστικές αλυσίδες δημιουργούν μια νέα πραγματικότητα. Και μέσα σε αυτή τη νέα πραγματικότητα, η διατλαντική σχέση μεταξύ Ευρώπης και Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών παραμένει όχι μόνο ισχυρή, αλλά απολύτως κρίσιμη για τη σταθερότητα, τις επενδύσεις και τη βιώσιμη ανάπτυξη της παγκόσμιας οικονομίας. Σύμφωνα με την έκθεση Transantlantic Economy 2026 που παρουσιάζουμε στη σημερινή εκδήλωση, η διατλαντική οικονομία αγγίζει πλέον τα 9,8 τρισεκατομμύρια δολάρια, ενώ καθημερινά διακινούνται αγαθά και υπηρεσίες αξίας άνω των 6,4 δισεκατομμυρίων δολαρίων μεταξύ Ευρώπης και Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών. Τα στοιχεία αυτά δεν αποτυπώνουν απλώς το μέγεθος μιας οικονομικής σχέσης. Αποτυπώνουν έναν από τους σημαντικότερους πυλώνες οικονομικής σταθερότητας, επενδυτικής συνεργασίας, τεχνολογικής καινοτομίας και κοινής στρατηγικής προοπτικής στον κόσμο. Για την Ελλάδα ειδικότερα, τα στοιχεία είναι ιδιαίτερα ενθαρρυντικά. Οι εμπορικές και επενδυτικές σχέσεις Ελλάδας-Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών παρουσιάζουν σταθερή δυναμική, με το διμερές εμπόριο αγαθών να φτάνει τα 4,9 δισεκατομμύρια δολάρια, τις αμερικανικές επενδύσεις στην Ελλάδα να ανέρχονται στα 1,9 δισεκατομμύρια δολάρια και περισσότερες από 24.000 θέσεις εργασίας να υποστηρίζονται από αυτή τη συνεργασία. Αυτό όμως που έχει ακόμα μεγαλύτερη σημασία είναι ότι η Ελλάδα αναγνωρίζεται πλέον διεθνώς όχι μόνο ως ένας αξιόπιστος σύμμαχος ή ως ένας κόμβος, λόγω απλά και μόνο της γεωγραφικής της θέσης στην ευρύτερη περιοχή, αλλά ως μια χώρα που ενισχύει ουσιαστικά το στρατηγικό και επενδυτικό της αποτύπωμα. Οι σημαντικές επενδύσεις στην ενέργεια, τις υποδομές, τα logistics, την άμυνα, την ψηφιακή μετάβαση και τις νέες τεχνολογίες, σε συνδυασμό με το υψηλού επίπεδου ανθρώπινο δυναμικό της χώρας, δημιουργούν ένα αναπτυξιακό περιβάλλον με αυξανόμενο διεθνές ενδιαφέρον και σημαντικές δυνατότητες συνεργασίας. Κυρίες και κύριοι, το Ελληνοαμερικανικό Εμπορικό Επιμελητήριο διαχρονικά εργάζεται ακριβώς προς αυτή την κατεύθυνση. Λειτουργούμε ως γέφυρα μεταξύ της ελληνικής, της αμερικανικής και της ευρωπαϊκής επιχειρηματικής κοινότητας, ενισχύοντας το διάλογο, προωθώντας τις επενδύσεις και συμβάλλοντας στη διαμόρφωση ενός πιο ανταγωνιστικού και εξωστρεφούς οικονομικού περιβάλλοντος για τη χώρα μας. Η σημερινή συζήτηση αποκτά ιδιαίτερη αξία, καθώς δεν περιορίζεται μόνο στην ανάλυση αριθμών και δικτών. Επιδιώκουμε να κατανοήσουμε τι πραγματικά συμβαίνει αυτές τις εξελίξεις για τις επιχειρήσεις, τις επενδύσεις, την παραγωγή, την καινοτομία και τη θέση της χώρας μας στο διεθνές οικονομικό περιβάλλον. Και κυρίως να εξετάσουμε πώς αυτές οι ευκαιρίες που δημιουργούνται μπορούν να μετατραπούν σε συγκεκριμένες στρατηγικές, ουσιαστικές συνεργασίες και αποτελεσματικές πολιτικές που θα ενισχύσουν την ανταγωνιστικότητα και την αναπτυξιακή προοπτική της χώρας μας. Θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω θερμά όλους τους διακεκριμένους ομιλητές που θα ακολουθήσουν και φυσικά όλους σας για την παρουσία σας στη σημερινή εκδήλωση. Είναι ιδιαίτερα μεγάλη τιμή να σας έχουμε κοντά μας. Θα δώσω το λόγο τώρα στον κύριο Ηλία Σπιρτούνια, του Γενικό Διευθυντή του Ελληνοαμερικανικού Εμπορικού Επιμελητηρίου. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Thank you, President Sarakakis. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening or good morning, depending on where you are watching us from. There are moments in international economic relations when continuity is more important than change. And there are moments when the entire framework is being redefined. I believe we are currently living through the second kind of moment. The transatlantic relations are facing new tests, new pressures, and new expectations. Yet, at the same time, it remains one of the strongest and more consequential economic partnerships in modern times. Together, Europe and the United States account for nearly half of global GDP, trillions in trade and investment flows, and millions of jobs supported on both sides of the Atlantic. But today, the significance of transatlantic relations extend far beyond economics. Economic policy has become deeply interconnected with geopolitics, security, technology, energy, and industrial resilience. Questions that were once discussed primarily in financial or commercial terms are now also strategic questions. Who controls critical supply chains? Where will strategic industries be located? How do democracies protect technological competitiveness? How do allies reduce dependencies while maintaining open markets? The war in Ukraine and the Middle East, rising geopolitical competition, and the acceleration of industrial policy globally have all reinforced the need for stronger coordination between Europe and the United States. At the same time, the green transition and digital transformation are creating entirely new areas for investment, innovation, and economic cooperation. In this changing environment, Greece has an important opportunity. Our country is increasingly recognized not only as a pillar of stability in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also as an emerging energy, logistic, infrastructure, and technology hub connecting Europe with broader regional markets. The challenge now is how to transform strategic positioning into long-term economic value. More investments, stronger competitiveness, higher value-added production, and deeper integration into transatlantic supply chains. This discussion is therefore both timely and necessary. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from distinguished experts and policymakers who will help us better understand where the transatlantic economy is heading, what risks and opportunities lie ahead, and how Greece can strengthen its role within this evolving landscape. I would like to thank my colleague Katerina Dzagaroulaki for her valuable contribution in organizing this event, and also Fani Zouro from Thessaloniki, and once again all our speakers and participants for joining us, and I'm sure we all are looking forward to very productive conversation. And we will start our first part with the transatlantic relations, and it's a pleasure to have with us Thibault Lortie, who is the Chief Policy and Public Affairs Officer at AmCham EU. He will help us to better understand the scale, depth, and strategic importance of the transatlantic economy. AmCham EU actually, and Thibault has consistently provided some of the most in-depth analysis on US-Europe economic ties, investment flows, and sectoral trends. Thibault will walk us through the key findings shaping the transatlantic economic outlook for 2026 based on the annual Transatlantic Economy report published in collaboration with AmCham EU, the US Chamber of Commerce, Johns Hopkins University, and the Transatlantic Leadership Network, and supported by several AmChams, including our AmCham Greece. Thibault, welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Idas, and it's really a pleasure to join you all today or this afternoon, this morning, depending on where you sit. And just to say, indeed, thank you so much to AmCham Greece for the support to this research, which is really valuable to us. And so I'll quickly walk you through some of the findings. I think, as Ilias mentioned, we are at a pivotal moment. The headlines are really flashing with, frankly, quite a negative story around the transatlantic relationship. Today, we're going to tell a slightly different one. We're going to tell the story of the economic relationship, the ties that bind Europe and the United States. And so let's take a look actually with this short video at the state of the transatlantic economy today in 2026. Let's take a look. And so if there is one number we're taking away, certainly from this year's report, is 9.8 trillion. That is the value of the transatlantic economy. I mean, little needed to say, it's the largest, the most integrated, frankly, the most consequential economic relationship in the world. And that you see really in the numbers from the report. What you're looking at now is a comparison between different parts of the world as we're looking at the relationship between US and a range of regions around the world. We're looking at two things. We're looking at both trade, the goods and the services that are kind of going across potentially the US and Europe, or the US and, say, Mexico and Canada. But we're also looking at sales. And I think that's an important element to understand the deep economic integration between Europe and the United States. It's not just trade, it's not just the goods and the services going across the Atlantic, it's also the sales. It's basically American companies that have set shop in Europe, have affiliates here that operate as European companies deeply integrated in the market, but also the other way around. European companies that have found great opportunities in the US have created companies over there and operate from the US as a market. And so that's the reason why you see that kind of first bar on the chart that really shows the importance of the sales that are done by American companies in Europe, European companies in the US. You look at the third bar, you see the value of the trade, the fourth bar, sorry, the value of the trade relationship between Europe and the United States. So I think it's extremely important to understand just how deeply interconnected we are. And as you compare with other regions in the world, the relationship that the US has with Europe is just unparalleled. If we're looking at 2025 specifically, despite a lot of the turbulence, of course, that we've been seeing, especially in the political relationship, as we're looking at trade flows potentially being redefined around the world as US trade policy evolves, we're seeing actually a record-breaking year. You look at numbers when it comes to trade between Europe and the US, and both goods and services, record-breaking. You look at affiliate performance. So how well European companies in the US are doing, how well American companies in Europe are doing, record numbers. And you look at energy, which of course, especially in the current environment, as we're looking at, the disruption coming from the Middle East, and parallel and match in terms of the importance of that energy partnership between Europe and the US. So those numbers are extremely impressive and just show the density and the importance of that economic relationship. If we look at investment flows, it is similar. We're looking at US FDI, foreign direct investment, coming out of the US, going to different parts of the world. We're seeing over the years, 56% of that US FDI goes to Europe, 17% to Asia Pacific, 13% to Canada and Mexico. Again, really showing that at the end of the day, Europe is the main destination for US FDI around the world. To give you just a quick stat, US FDI in Europe in stock, if you look at the history, is 3.5 times more than US FDI investment in Asia Pacific. Really impressive. It's also true the other way around. If you're looking at how foreign companies have invested in the US, you're seeing really how the presence of European investments is important to the US economy. EU foreign direct investment in the US actually double than the Asian investment that you find in the United States. Again, making the point of that mutually beneficial economic relationship that we're seeing across the Atlantic. If we're comparing, I was making the point earlier, sales and actually exports that are being made between Europe and the US, again, we're seeing incredible numbers there. US affiliates, US companies in Europe are actually really compared selling a lot of products and services in Europe compared to how much they're shipping across the Atlantic. So that also says something about, and I'll get to that in a second, some of the policy conversation that is very focused on trade and sometimes misses a bit of a big part of what that economic relationship is about, which is ultimately companies on both sides of the Atlantic deeply integrated and doing business. If we look at it the other way around, we look at European companies that are invested in the US, but we're also looking at European trade and exports going to the US. And we see there, again, the difference, how much that economic relationship is also driven by companies operating in each other's market, deeply integrated. at the end of the day, when you look at the performance of those companies, we're seeing here how important, again, each other are. So therefore, we're looking at how American companies are operating around the world, and their earnings, 54% of the profits of US companies actually being made in Europe compared to other parts of the world. Again, Asia Pacific only represents 22% in comparison. If we're looking at the US and how international companies have been operating there, we're seeing that actually, if you look at all of the global earnings by foreign companies, there 41% actually come from the European Union, again, making the point of that deep integration. The value of the relationship is true for Europe as a whole, for the EU, it's true for the US, but it's also true for the states and the member states. If we're looking at both sides of the Atlantic, we're looking at here the numbers for Greece, again, making the point of how much Greece as a member state benefits from the deep connection that exists with the United States. Importantly as well, what we're looking at here is direct impact. What's important as well is all of the value that's generated as a result of those connections. As we're looking at the supply chains, we're looking at the indirect impact of companies investing and how that ultimately benefits communities, in this case in Greece. And that's a story that is true and needs to be told all around Europe, really, about the importance of the relationship. Where does that leave us right now from a political standpoint and policy standpoint? We have a deal that was struck back in August. It's almost a year from now between Europe and the United States. President von der Leyen, President Trump agreed to this trade framework between Europe and the US. It's taken quite a bit of time to implement for a range of reasons, with the political priorities on both sides as well, and some of the geopolitical turbulence we've experienced. It's actually a very important day today. We have in Europe, the European Parliament and the member states that are negotiating today on one small part, but important part of this larger framework agreement, looking at tariff reduction proposals. Hopefully, the EU today can agree to the final implementation of those tariff reduction proposals so that we can actually move on with the rest of the deal that was struck in Scotland that looks at a lot more than tariffs. It looks at cybersecurity and what we can do together. It looks at supply chain resilience, critical minerals. So a range of other things that would ultimately benefit companies, citizens operating on both sides of the Atlantic. So for us, that's a really big milestone today, hopefully with some good news coming out of Strasbourg, actually, where the meeting will take place later today. And with that, Elias, happy to go back to you, see if you've got any questions as we're looking at those numbers together.
Very much, Thibaut. Thank you really for this very informative, let's say, preview of the economic report. And also thank AmCham EU for its valuable contribution to that. Speaking about policymakers, since you mentioned this, which data point or trend in this year transatlantic economic overview do you believe deserves more attention from policymakers, both sides of the Atlantic, right?
I think certainly often there is a really big focus on trade specifically, and I think sometimes it gets kind of missed in the political priorities and the headline, how much investment actually drive the relationship. And investment doesn't just happen one day from another. It's really over the years, the commitment of a lot of companies on both sides that have seen opportunities, frankly, in the European market or the US market, and have created very integrated operations overall with supply chains that are, deeply integrated with goods and parts coming out, but also ultimately with those companies operating in each other market. Concretely, from a policy perspective, what does it mean? It means that for American companies operating in Europe, but also European companies operating in the US, they all need an environment that is ultimately conducive to growth, to innovation on both sides of the Atlantic. And so, when we focus on the transatlantic relationship, we look at trade and it's important and we need to find ways to facilitate that. But we also need to bring that conversation about actually how do we strengthen the case for investing, whether it's in the US or in Europe, and also not thinking that it's a zero-sum game, that if a company decides to invest in the US, they're only going to invest in the US. Or if they decide to make an investment in the EU, they're only going to invest in the EU. As we're seeing, our companies are looking at a range of places around the world, frankly, and sometimes also outside of the transatlantic relationship, and thinking, okay, where does it make sense for us to drive a project? And I think bringing the conversation back to how do we strengthen the case for investing in the transatlantic economy would be valuable.
Continuing about policymakers, you're in Brussels, so I guess continuously you're in contact with policymakers there, but also you had the opportunity to travel to US, and actually the last travel with our AmChams in Europe Association, we had several meetings there. So my question is, how do policymakers in Europe and US perceive the outcome of this report and generally the relations, and if the numbers mean differently to them, how their perception is the same? Because to my understanding and to many people, sometimes there's a different perception from both sides.
Yeah, I think both sides recognize the importance of the relationship. I think our role as the business community as well is to make sure that just remains really high on the agenda. And I think as policymakers on both sides have to deal with a wide range of priorities, ultimately, it's also our job to go back and say, well, look at the value of that relationship, the reason why we all need to invest. And so I think, the importance of that economic relationship isn't necessarily questioned. I think our struggle currently is to find ways for Europe and the United States to align their political priorities. And so to find ways to ensure that as we develop policies on both sides, we think about, okay, well, actually, where does it make sense that we do more work together? So let me give you one example. We've seen 2 weeks ago now, Europe and the EU and the US signing an agreement on critical minerals, thinking actually if we want to enable the digital transition, more low carbon technology, we actually need those critical minerals. And it makes a lot of sense for the EU and the US, frankly, to work together with some other allies to make sure that ultimately our companies are able to benefit from those and to use those as we enable those transitions on both sides. And there isn't a big kind of reason for us to compete. Frankly, there is a reason for us to work together. And I think that's maybe helping both sides continuing to see the value as opposed to maybe the negatives of working together, because frankly, that relationship is too big to fail when you look at the numbers.
And I think this is our role as well as AmChams, to try, to maybe translate, to each one's language, numbers, and also advocate, for these relations as the most we can. Thank you, Thibaut, for the very comprehensive overview of the study. And I guess, you will stay connected because you might have some questions by the audience later. So you might, step in, to answer to some of those questions. But thank you again. So, ladies and gentlemen, data give us an important micro picture, but numbers alone never tell us the full story. Behind the figures are political choices, strategic shifts, and changing global realities. And that's why we're moving to our second panel discussion titled Interpreting the Data, How Do Numbers Really Tell Us? And we have, we're delighted to host Mrs. Elena Lazaru from ELIAMEP. She's a Director General of ELIAMEP. She has an extensive expertise in European governance and strategic affairs. And also with us is Ms. Ivana Zuzul, Vice President for Europe at the US Chamber of Commerce. And she works at the forefront of the transatlantic business and policy engagement. Ladies, welcome to our event here. Do we have you online here? Oh, yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us. So let's have some interesting conversation here. I will start with Elena. Can I speak in with the small names, or I guess
absolutely,
we can?
absolutely. I should just warn you, I have a very bad connection because I'm in a hotel in Berlin. So if anything happens, it's not because you used my name, my first name. It's because the connection is bad.
It's all right. It's all right. No, thank you. And lovely city, by the way, Berlin. So first question to you is, how much has geopolitics changed the way economic policy is now designed?
So I think I want to answer that as, first of all, by saying I'm not an economist, but as I've been looking at EU policies for a very long time, what I want to focus on, and, following up on the previous speaker who I listened to with a lot of interest, is the geoeconomic turn and the geopolitical turn in EU trade policy. Because now we're talking about EU-US relations and Greece-US relations. And of course, what we're talking about is economic figures and inflation. But at the end of the day, what we want to understand is how geopolitics and geoeconomics have affected the trade and investment relationship between the two. Not forgetting how that, in 2025, the trade in services and the trade in goods between the EU and the US is the closest and the biggest relationship in the world in trade terms. But we've seen indeed that for the European Union, and of course that means Greece as well, as trade is an EU competence, geoeconomics have really altered the nature of how trade is seen. And I say this because, it's been a number of years now under the two von der Leyen commissions, and I would say it even started with the Juncker Commission, that there's been a shift in trade policy trying to reconcile the openness that the EU abides by and multilateralism with a certain degree of resilience and autonomy in trade. And that means that both in terms of who the EU trades with and what kind of trade deals it makes, it is diversifying its portfolio to ensure that supply chain resilience is achieved. And secondly, when it comes to the kind of regulations, the kind of laws that affect the way that trade is carried out, we've seen an increase in the amount of and the type of regulations that attempt to limit coercive trade and so coercive action towards the EU's economy. So in that sense, we've seen instruments that address coercive action in trade. We've seen instruments that address the types of investments that weaponize critical infrastructure. We've seen attempts to have established in regulatory action a level playing field in international procurement and international investment. And all of this is really about geoeconomics and geopolitics. It's about China. It's about the way that certain goods are really, controlled by certain countries. And for the classic thing we mentioned here is, critical raw minerals and the amount of exports of those that China processes, refines, and exports, and chips. So all of these, I don't want to talk more because I know this is a quick conversation, but this is the kind of ways in which I think trade has been affected, and by proxy the economy as well, because that means that you also need an economy which to a degree reshores but also diversifies sources of production.
Thank you, Lena. Ivana, when you look at the current economic indicators, are you fundamentally optimistic or cautious about the future of transatlantic relations? You are the forefront, actually, of the transatlantic. I think this question is perfect for you.
Yeah, both professionally and personally, because I was born and raised in Croatia, and I've now been in the United States for a long time. So the transatlantic relationship is important to me, not just from where I sit at the U.S. chamber, but on a deeply personal and family level. Like I'll speak to the transatlantic commercial relationship, which is complex enough without expanding the conversation into the security or political dimension. Although increasingly we're seeing that all three of those are interlinked, and a lot of the concerns and I would say conflict that we are seeing in the political sphere is unfortunately beginning to bleed over into the commercial sphere as well, which I think thus far has been relatively insulated from, again, some of those political dynamics. I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. This is the world's largest and most important trading relationship. It is a trading relationship that has time and again demonstrated remarkable resilience, including over this last period of really global, economic, political, strategic upheavals. I'm optimistic because I think the numbers, and I know Thibaut went into some of this, sort of the top line numbers do not actually paint an accurate picture of just how deeply integrated our commercial ties are. It's not just about trade in goods and services. It's about investment in each other's markets and the types of investments we make in each other's markets. Those types of investments tend to be built on shared research and development, investment in innovation, growth of jobs. I think we've really become embedded in each other's, host economies in a way that we don't see happening with other trading partners. But there is a growing divergence in areas beyond trade that make, I think, the political foundation of the relationship much less stable. And as I said, there are headwinds, I think, that are spilling over from that political sphere into the economic sphere. So we're seeing, the rise of protectionism, and I know we'll sort of get into this more a little bit later. We are, seeing potentially restricting market access to trading partners, including between the US and the EU. And I think for the EU, one notable economic indicator is the reduction in US FDI in the EU in this past year. I think that is happening both because of developments here in the United States, but also because of developments in the EU. Frankly, for US capital as well, the US is becoming a more attractive place to invest rather than the EU. I think the EU is facing some structural challenges, such as market fragmentation. I think it is facing some difficult global challenges, including really high energy prices and a high cost of production. But it is also facing a lot of regulatory challenges that, again, are making particularly new investments, which is where we are seeing the biggest drop in FDI, posing some genuine questions about the long-term attractiveness of the EU as an investment destination. So I think we have to be cognizant of that trend and try to get ahead of that trend.
Actually, you mentioned this before. It was my next question to you and also to Elena as well. How serious? I mean, we all seen, have seen, how the tariffs situation has gone. Actually, right now we have the overturn, from the Supreme Court of the tariffs, and we don't know exactly where this will end up. But anyway, how serious is the risk of increasing protectionism here? Ivana and then Elena, please.
Sure. I would say the risk is very serious. This is a top concern of the Chamber's Europe team for this year when we look at the US-EU relationship. Look, I think we are sort of in a new strategic era of trade policy, right? Where we're using tariffs, subsidies, industrial policy, not just for protection, but sort of as instruments of geopolitical competition. I think a lot of this is happening or began to happen in response to pressures both of our markets are seeing from China, including from industrial overcapacity, threat of theft of intellectual property. But it is now becoming increasingly a marker in the US-EU relationship as well. I will just say from the onset, the Chamber has never been a huge supporter of Buy America or Buy American provisions unless they are very narrowly targeted at answering very specific national security or national economic interests. Having said that, I do think that there is a misunderstanding of just how those are structured in practice and how EU firms are accessing public procurement in the United States. We are seeing really worrying proposals coming out of the EU, including under the Industrial Accelerator Act. We're watching very closely what will happen in July when the Commission proposes changes to the overall public procurement directive. We've seen, again, some worrying trends on the Defense Procurement Directive. We're seeing concerning trends on tech sovereignty, cloud infrastructure, and again, the ability of our companies to participate fairly in the European market. And I think the threat of escalation is also very real. I believe if we sort of move in this direction on the EU side, we will move in this direction on the US side, and it won't be proportional to the perceived level of threat or economic risk. So where does that kind of leave us? I mean, I think resilience, we are in a moment where resilience is a serious question. And I think both the US and the EU do have to think very strategically around how to build resilience in their markets, in their economies, and in their supply chains. We would caution that resilience should not be equalized to localization requirements, which I think is what we sometimes see reflected in policy. And I think that there's not just room, but really an imperative for the EU and the US to think through how do we structure joint resilience. Because frankly, the types of competitive markets that allow US companies to compete effectively are also the types of competitive markets that allow EU companies to compete effectively, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in the United States. And so we need to think jointly about how do we protect those competitive markets from being able to function appropriately without undue stress on the transatlantic relationship. But it's the political dynamics, I think, are taking over. And I'm worried they're going to create a commercial reality that will be negative for years, well after those political dynamics shift in either direction.
Well, that drives me to the question about, the policymakers. Actually, I think, Elena, you can answer this one. And of course, anyone can step in, the conversation and comment on each other's, answer. Do you think, not do you think, actually, we are observing this, a growing mistrust between policymakers in US and EU. And okay, how this can be fixed? And what is the role of business sectors in this, in fixing this? Because business sector at the end, they have a saying here. So what do you think of that?
Thank you. And I'll comment on that. And I'll also sort of piggyback on some things that Ivana said, because I completely agree with her. And so before I go to your question, there's a couple of things just to reinforce what she said. The trend that we call protectionism and goes under many names. It goes under the name Made in XYZ, and we're seeing an increasing, Ivana speaking from the US, and we've been talking in Europe a lot about, this Made in America brand that has been synonymous for Europe with the threat of, some degree of protectionism. But increasingly in Europe, you also hear the Made in Europe very, very much. And I think the various legislative components that Ivana mentioned allude or very explicitly refer to that. Defense is a sector that Ivana mentioned, and we're seeing that very much there, but it goes to other areas again. And I actually, it's a phenomenon we're seeing elsewhere. If you go to India, you go to, a degree of autonomy and, sort of reshoring and also sort of homegrown production. And I mean, I won't even mention China, but that is happening globally. And it's been happening for a while. I just think we've had at least 3 geopolitical phenomena that have accelerated that. One has definitely been COVID, because the realization of dependencies that came through that. The second is the proliferation of conflicts with parties that were not aligned with the US or the US, and that weaponized those kinds of export controls to actually create these kinds of dependencies and really create economic and political instability through weaponizing them. And the third, and we're seeing that very clearly now with the Straits of Hormuz, is actually the geographical component of weaponization of trade, and how that also creates a sense of a need for not only resilience, but also a degree of autarky, if you want, to have enough and to create enough and to have an industry that is enough to serve the market. So all of this is leading to these Made in XYZ phenomenon being embedded in legislation and being supported. It's actually a move that 10 years ago, we were talking about deglobalization. And I think in many ways it speaks to that as well, because the more we see that multilateral organizations like the WTO and others become increasingly less abided by, we're also seeing at the same time these kind of phenomena. And so, we're seeing this across the board and to a degree, and here I speak because I'm a security and defense person, to a degree, invoking national emergencies and defense and security priorities there does make sense. So I think there is a degree to which each entity is increasingly as well in an environment where we don't really see the kind of alliances that we used to see, where states agree on across the board the issues. It's more like we have now little coalitions on different fronts of different things. So on energy, you may agree with one party, but then on another area, you agree. I think it makes sense to have a degree of, it also makes economies competitive, of productivity at home. It creates job markets. These are things that everyone is thinking about. But on the other hand, we have to think about, in a time of increasing need for resilience and incorporation of resilience in legislation, how do we also do this together thing that Ivana mentioned? And I think building resilience together, and for the US and EU and for allies in general, is really the bet here. And the solution, I think, is in a form of, and I'm not advocating for one or the other name for it, the Trade and Technology Council that existed a few years ago between the EU and the US it's just a mechanism, but it is a mechanism really to think about those key issues that define this protectionism that you mentioned, export controls, technology transfer, sanctions, regulatory instruments, at least to have a forum of kind of understanding how one affects the other and to sort of think of some degree of alignment. If that were possible, I think this would definitely be a way to move on some of these fronts, and also to address obstacles, because as Ivana has mentioned, on both sides, I think legislation creates challenges for the other side, right? And this is not about who is in government at the, we've seen this also before. We saw that with the CHIPS Act, we saw it with the Inflation Reduction Act, the way what it meant for Europe, and of course on the other side of the Atlantic, Ivan has mentioned a number of items, regulatory items that have created this. There needs to be a forum of frank discussion, but not only discussion, but sort of addressing these grievances, because the truth of the matter is we are living in a world where scale and size matters. And yes, we may have the biggest trading relationship in the world right now, but that is not a constant, and we see demographically, if only, but also in terms of GDP, the growth of other actors in the world. And the way that the reorganization of the energy security environment as well is affecting productivity and markets, this might end up creating a very new constellation of powers, and we need to be ready to address it. A final point, because Ivana mentioned the structural challenges that Europe faces and how that is at times deterring investment, and this is something I think that really needs to be addressed on the European side, and we do see the relevant policy being produced. A couple of other things that need to be addressed is the energy cost of production in the EU. It remains much higher than in the US at the moment, and there are efforts to address this. Innovation scaling, which I think you alluded to, is not only as competitive as the US innovation scaling, but also fragmented. And of course, the biggest thing right now that we're talking about on the EU side is the integration of capital markets. And I think this, the completion of the single market, the Letta report, the Draghi report, these are things that inevitably are necessary to create this kind of investment and innovation environment that we need.
That's correct. By the way, speaking about other powers surfacing, of course, we're talking about China right now. First of all, I will ask Ivana how the U.S. Chamber viewed the recent travel to President Trump's and the economic outcome of this, let's say, negotiation with China. And on the other hand, also, I want to ask you. To conclude. And on the other hand, I want to ask whether China might be, let's say, the how to say that, the opportunity for the two continents to get together and start aligning in many other things. For example, Thibault mentioned that a week ago was a signing of this critical minerals agreement between EU and the US, and I think probably that was signed because of some geopolitical also concerns. So can you elaborate on this one?
Look, I would not sort of comment on any of the political
economic
of the president's visit. I mean, look, I think what we sort of saw coming from the visit is kind of a continued détente of where the relationship stands now. By the fall, we will be looking at the expiration of the temporary Chinese ban on exports of sensitive materials. I do expect to see that we will see that extended as we get near into the fall. And I think that's why we're seeing some indications around a potential second meeting of the US and China with that aim. But none of sort of the inherent challenges of the relationship have been addressed. And they're going to be really, really difficult to address. When it comes to the US and the EU, I think the critical minerals MOU and then action plan is a really positive first step, both in the opportunities that it creates, but also in the type of trajectory that it can create. We know that critical raw materials, access to energy, access to high technology, access to critical infrastructure, whether it's maritime or it's road or rail. These are places where, frankly, the US government, I would say, over the last decade and a half, has not placed a lot of thought in terms of what is happening in the rest of the world and what is that creating in terms of a strategic security, but also economic problem for the United States. And I think Europe is facing the same challenges. Both sides were really enthusiastic about the deal. I actually was kind of surprised at the relatively muted public rollout, because I think privately we heard both from the EU Commission, but also from the US government, that the negotiations had gone really well. Even in this very challenging moment where negotiations on everything else, including hopefully we're in a better place at the end of today in terms of the tariff deal, are not going particularly smoothly. So I think that speaks to the strategic importance and the value that we still place on this relationship. Let's see how it goes. I think it's important to build sort of a small initial success case and then see if it can be extended and expanded into other critical areas. But again, I view it as really a recognition by the US government. There are places here that we cannot go at this alone. And it's really, really critical that we have those commercial alliances to create the backbone of a resilient supply chain.
Well, let's hope this is a prelude, for more to come, actually, agreements on other levels or issues. Speaking about, the perception of the policymakers, I guess, this has to do also with the composition of the political, let's say, environment in both actually continents. They're not, in US we did have, in the past, very two solid, let's say, parties, having some differences, but on the let's say on the foreign policy and everything, they were quite the same. In EU we have all kind of parties here, so I think this has to do, so I guess some of the things that we are not let's say listening and hearing are part of the rhetoric, because at the end we see agreements like the one that we just talked about, and maybe more to come actually, because at the end we see that there is only one way, how we can collaborate and work together, because this relation between Europe, and US, it's a long-standing relation, and it's beyond economics. It's based on values, on traditions, and many things. Okay, any comment on that?
I can comment. You're going into my political science field. No, I think you're absolutely right, and maybe I'll jump on what you said to take the opportunity to say that I think when it comes to politics, we have to try and not pay attention to the noise on many fronts. And speaking of Europe, for example, we like to monitor very closely, citizens also. Small fringe parties that may have devastating rhetoric for global affairs and foreign policy, but in fact what is worth monitoring is actually the consensus, as you said, and we've spoken about a number of trade related instruments, for example, which have been passed as EU level law, and that means they've passed both through the Council, so through the governments of the member states, but also through the European Parliament, through a majority that is quite, majorities are quite robust in the European Parliament. So I think it's important to know and to notice that, if there is an instrument and, against coercion in trade, it's because there is a huge majority that has gone for it on both the national member state government level and on the European Parliament level, which represents, the political forces. And that goes for every instrument that has to do with, the energy policy, the trade policy, etc., industrial policy. So it's important to say that is a consensus-based, a majority, yes, but, it's a big qualified majority. And at the same time, I think it's also important to pay attention to those, we talk again, when we look at US politics, the tendency, you read the newspapers to see what are the great polarization issues, and there are, and I'm not undermining their importance, but it's also important to see where are the bipartisan in Congress agreements when it comes to trade, when it comes to China. I think these are the kind of things that, one always needs to pay attention to. Having said that, because you had asked me a question about businesses and I didn't really address it, and maybe now as we approach the end, it's the time to say, trade policy, but also foreign policy today, in a time of, as we have said, geoeconomics, is no longer only about policymakers. It is also about businesses. It is about other stakeholders as well. And we've seen the way in which those can step up and be part of, bilateral and multilateral relationships. So what I want to say is also that you mentioned, what role do businesses play, and what role do, worker associations play, and what roles do universities play, because they also play a role in building the skills and contributing to the upskilling and the reskilling that makes economies competitive. All of this at a time where, as has been said, energy, transport, maritime security, shipbuilding, digital infrastructure building, the latest space-based technology, artificial intelligence, all these have become areas which are extremely important to determining geopolitical constellations of power, but none of those are achievable without the constant exchange of communication, of the bottlenecks, of the needs, of the need for injection of capital from the business sector to the policymakers and vice versa. But also, I want to stress the human capital side of this, the understanding that this also involves a very important investment in people, in skills, because that is also, to me, something that links both the needs of the policymakers and the businesses on both sides of the Atlantic. If that kind of competitiveness will be achieved, which in the end will give leverage both on the diplomatic or geopolitical side, but also on the geoeconomic and trade side, because let's not forget, in my lifetime, these are, interlinked more than ever.
Thank you, Elena. 1 minute, something, Ivana, maybe you want to add or comment or say something before we close this session?
No, only to thank you, Elias. It's always a pleasure to speak to you, whether virtually or in person. And we at the Chamber are really grateful to you and to your team and to AmChams that we have across Europe for really sort of pushing the message of the importance of this relationship at a company level, at a state economy level, but also at the global level. So thank you for everything that you're doing, and it's always a pleasure to partner with you.
And we thank the U.S. Chamber also, because, we are very good, let's say we are aligned in many things, and definitely, we need each other, to connect, the two continents and advocate, for the common goals that we do have here. So, ladies, thank you very much, for joining, this event here, and I hope you stay online, because we have right now the bilateral thing. Maybe, you want to stay online here. So we're moving now.
Add my thanks? I didn't get the chance to thank, but I also want to thank you. Sorry for intervening like this, but I also want to thank you for having had us, and Ivana as well for listening to her. I hope I meet you in person as well one day. And I also want to thank the American Hellenic Chamber of Commerce for including us think tankers in this meeting, because I think this is a multi-stakeholder issue. And thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Really, we appreciate your collaboration, your presence here, and we're looking forward, for, let's say, physical, panel next time. Okay. So we continue now, ladies and gentlemen, on the bilateral. Let's talk about the bilateral economic and trade relations here. We will start with a deep dive into the U.S.-Greece economic and trade relation. We are delighted, to have with us Mr. Dionysis Protopapas, who is, of course, head of economic and commercial affairs at the Embassy of Greece in Washington, D.C. Hi, Dionysis, good to see you. And also, we're joined with Katerina Sokou, who leads our Washington, D.C. office of the American Hellenic Chamber of Commerce in the U.S. Hello, Katerina. So, welcome both. You are, of course, on the other side of the Atlantic at this time, but I think you are the appropriate person to discuss this session on what the U.S.-Greece economic and trade relations are at the moment. So, Dionysus, I know you have a kind of a presentation, okay?
Yes, that's correct. A very brief one, not to take much time. So, let me...
You will share it on the screen, I guess, right?
Yes, yes. Okay, so can you see it? I guess we can.
Something is coming up. Yep, here is.
Okay, so again, I'll try to be brief. Nowadays, the U.S. foreign policy is commercial diplomacy. That's how the U.S. government defines its foreign policy. But by commercial diplomacy, it means probably economic diplomacy. It's a lot more, many more things. Briefly, it has to do with defense, energy, shipping and shipbuilding, supply chains, critical minerals, and technology and artificial intelligence. For a country to be relevant and important to the United States, it has to fit into those priorities. And I think that Greece adapted its foreign policy very fast after the second Trump administration started. I think that we fit in nicely in those sectors, perhaps with the exception of the critical minerals, where we only have copper and gallium, and not many of the other things. So you're all familiar with what is happening in Greece right now with data centers, and the US investments is present in a lot of them. I won't talk a lot about this because we'll have the time to talk later. Again, Greek investment in the US is valued at around $2.5 billion. We are present in several fields. A few people know that 27 Greek-owned shipping companies are listed in the US stock exchange. Our main investment here comes from the group of Titan Cement. They operate 3 plants, 3 ports, and many more facilities to support their operations. Hellenic Cables is implementing an investment of $300 USD in Virginia, which will be ready by next year, and where they will be producing cables, electrical cables, and later on in the future also subsea cables. Other investments involve Sunlight, Faye, as everybody knows, Megas Gyros, and so on. Now, the US investments in Greece are very important. The US is steadily one of the top 3 or top 5 foreign investors. But there one has to remember that the top foreign investors in Greece are, let's say, Luxembourg, Netherlands, or Cyprus, countries through which usually multinationals channel their investments. So an investment through those countries may be coming in reality from another country. The fact is that in the meetings that we have here in Washington with US companies, we see that all of the companies we meet have invested in Greece, not now, but 10, 20, 30 years ago. And they are, and even though we are trying to see if there are complaints and if there are things we can change and help them, almost always they say that they are happy with their investments and with the activity they have in Greece. And that's a very nice thing to hear. I won't delve more into investment because I believe we'll talk about it a bit later. Let's talk a bit about the US tariffs, which is in the news for the past year. The situation right now is that EU exports in the US face a 10% tariff plus the MFN rate. Simply put, the MFN rate is the tariff that was in effect before the second Trump administration. So for some products, the import tariff is 10%. For some other products, it may be 10 plus the MFN, which can be, let's say, another 2 or 5 or 10%. This regime will last until the end of July. It expires then, and we have to see what will happen then. A critical issue is that there are 6 plus 2 investigations in progress by the US administration, which are expected to conclude in July or August. And this is an effort by the US administration to replace the existing regime with new tariffs based on a different legal framework. Now, I believe that those investigations will affect EU exports, but not Greek exports too much, because the Greek export mix is different than, let's say, the German export mix or French or the Dutch. So I'm quite confident that after July, Greek exports will mainly be facing the tariffs that were in effect before the Trump administration took over, which is a good thing. Now, there are sectors which face higher tariffs, like steel, aluminum, and copper, where the tariff is 50%, and the derivatives of those products face a 25% tariff. That regime is not expected to change. The strange, let's say, the paradox here is that when those tariffs were imposed, our exports in specifically those sectors, those products, went up significantly. So steel went up. Steel exports from Greece went up by 183%, even though the tariff is 50%. The explanation for that is probably that the demand in the US is much larger than the domestic supply. So the US industries have to continue importing raw materials from abroad. And in order to increase production, they have to increase their imports. That's why we see such a significant increase in those products. On the other hand, our food exports fell a bit, around 5%. And that's, of course, is understood because they faced the new tariffs. However, the bilateral trade between Greece and the US it stands at 4.75 billion euros. Greece is recording a slight surplus of around 60 million when we count in fuels and refinery products. But if we take the refinery products out, then our trade surplus goes up to 660 million euros. The US exports, half of them are fuels, and mainly LNG, because as everybody knows, the US has become the largest exporter in the world for LNG. On the other hand, Greece exports to the US jet fuel, which is practically the fuel that the US aircraft get when they reach Greek airports in the 6-7 months of the summer period. This is counted as export. I won't get into details about specific products. Again, the same statement that I made earlier stands, that industrial products have gone up, while the food sector seems to be having a slight decrease. And let's conclude the presentation here to not take too much time.
Thank you, Dionysis. Let's put also Katerina on the screen, if we may, so we can have a conversation, the three of us here. Okay, I will ask you, Dionysis, first of all. Okay, can Greece, can Greece become a stronger regional hub for supply chains and connectivity? I mean, what do you see from your contacts, in the US? Is there an interest, for such investment? For example, we're hearing about the CPRs here.
Yes.
So what is your, let's say,
my answer would be definitely yes, and we're already seeing that. Let's not forget that Onyx, the Elefsis shipyard, has been revived also thanks to a loan financing by DFC, the US Development Finance Corporation, of 120 million USD. That was the restart of the Greek shipbuilding industry in Greece. So it is being done with US capital. DFC is also investing in Thriasio, which is it's going to be the major logistics hub Greece has in the near future. So we see a lot of American interest. Another U.S. investment that not many people know that it's U.S. investment. It's the old Ελληνική Χαλιβουργία, the facilities in Elefsina. It's the group HIG, which is developing a new logistics hub that's also been funded with US funds. So there's a very strong interest in energy. Everybody hears those days about the vertical corridor and how US and Greek companies are cooperating in order to develop the corridor. There are very good prospects for SMRs, but not yet in, let's say, after 2-3 years, because the technology is still being developed. We are practically all the technology investments in data centers are being done with US technology. I hope that in a few weeks we'll hear an announcement by the EPPC, which is looking for an American hyperscaler to develop the new data center in Kozani. And to put it into perspective, the initial phase of that data center will have a capacity of 300 megawatts. Mm-hmm. The total existing capacity in Greece of data centers is 30 megawatts or 35 megawatts. So there is planning to create a data center 10 times larger than the total installed capacity. And that will be the first phase. So we see the US interest in investments in Greece to be very strong, very active, and I think that it's only going to get more important and larger in the future.
So thank you. And right now, moving to Katerina. Katerina, you've been living in the US for more than 8 or 9 years, 10 years maybe.
Well, 13, 14, I'm forgetting.
Right. Because my question has to do, how do American investors currently perceive Greece comparing, with 5 or 10 years ago, when you had a chance, to meet some of them, right?
So let's go 10 years ago. It was fun times. It was actually after the fun times of 2015. It was, so if we go to 2016, when Greece had exited the crisis, the financial and the most acute part of it. I mean, people were still not trusting the sustainability of the Greek debt. The Greek banks were not capitalized, so they couldn't support the economy and the investments. And during the crisis, despite the amazing opportunities that Greece was presenting at the height of the crisis, no one was willing to invest in Greece, other than a couple of very brave and very forward-looking investors from abroad. But so that was the case then. And 10 years on, we are at the point where the overall image of Greece in the US is at the highest point that it has ever been. And this is driven by, importantly, not just by the attractiveness of the country as a tourist destination, culture, it's also considered a safe destination. Coupled with the wide impression among US investors, and not only that the Greek government is willing to attract and hospitable to foreign investments, and the fact that it has been promoting a program that gives reforms and pro-business reforms to foreign investors and specific incentives, many incentives for them to come to Greece and invest. This has totally changed the game. So right now, Greece is being considered a good investment, a great investment destination. We see at our office here in Washington, D.C., a lot of interest from US investors, including from the diaspora that traditionally were a bit more cautious, given that they have been burned in the past with their investments in Greece. We do see and experience this heightened interest. And the question here is, how do we take advantage of that? And where do we see the prospects and how we build the conditions for this amazing interest to actually materialize.
So let's give me, the pass, for next question to you. By the way, I see that you're at the office, right? At our office there in DC, okay?
For sure, yes.
We have a lovely office, by the way, for the audience here, all right? So anyone who goes to DC, he or she can visit, our offices there. But anyway, what sectors currently offer the greatest untapped potential for the U.S.-Greece cooperation? And I mean not only in U.S. but also in Greece and in U.S. as well, right? For Greek companies to move into U.S. or for American companies to move to Greece. So what sectors, Katerina?
Yeah, and to follow up on what Dionysius was saying as well. I mean, your question to him about the theme of our discussion, Greece as a hub for the transatlantic economy, for the regional economy. All investments, be it energy-related, logistics, that tap into the geographic position of Greece and its important role and heightened role in the supply chains of the region, are really high political and business interest at the same time. So we see the DFC investing into that. These are the government affiliated investment of the US government here. So these are, we see this interest. Now, I call it untapped as well in a way, because the more complicated investments need a lot of regulatory improvements, and it's a process that might take a long time. So a simplification on the part of Greece and the Greek state of the processes and the regulatory requirements and the speed and maybe even the prioritization and a clear indication to the markets, to investors of what are the priority projects will help direct this investment and speed it up and bring it to specific projects that further strengthen, of course, the Greek economy, but also strategic positioning. And in the context of heightened geopolitical risks that we were talking about, you were talking about at your previous panel, this is even more important to focus on this right now.
Mm-hmm. I will come back to another question, but before I want to ask you, both of you, by the way, you mentioned about the structural barriers here. In your discussion, with let's say with American possible potential, let's say investors, either companies or institutional investors, have you, have you heard for any structural barriers that they have in mind? And can you elaborate on this?
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I think that one issue is the size, meaning that Greek companies we have few large companies. Most of our companies are small and medium-sized companies, which means that they fall outside, they don't fall within the radar of foreign investors. They are too small. So that's one problem. I think that the second problem that the institutional investors and large corporations have, that in some fields in Greece, the barriers to entry are very high, meaning that unless you find a Greek partner, foreign companies cannot get in the Greek market, even though it's a small market. So in let's say in construction, in energy, it's very difficult for a foreign company to find its way in Greece on its own, unless it partners with a Greek company, and that's often seems to be a problem. If we look on the other side, Greek investments in the US, I think we're going to hear good news in the following months, because I see there is interest from the large Greek companies like Terna, Metlen, which are not currently present in.
Dionysius, sorry, this is a result of the incentives, and also Katerina, you may step in at any time. This is a result of the incentives that the U.S. government is providing, let's say, or the states are providing, to companies to relocate or to open a subsidiary there.
Yes, absolutely, because there are strong incentives in the U.S. Which differ a lot from state to state. And even in sectors that, like renewables, that seem to be an anathema for the U.S. administration, the states pursue their own policies. So as long as a company does not require federal funding, or let's say to be located on federal lands, then the states pursue their own policy, and which one wouldn't think in the beginning when we hear the rhetoric from the federal government. So we definitely see signs that Greek companies will be more active in the US market in the near future.
Thank you. Yes, Katerina, you may, and I want to, before, please, yeah, continue, but also answer to the question right now. What services our AmSim's office in the US also offers and contributing, to these bilateral relations, This is in addition, to the answer for the...
Because we're serving both US based companies, right, and our members from Greece. So we do have this dual capacity here to, one, promote Greek entrepreneurship and a modern take, a current take on the Greek economy and its potential and its prospects to the US market, to the US stakeholders here, policymakers, opinion makers, US investors, our members here that have joined our membership from the US in order to gain this connection to the Greek economy and to AmSim Greece and to its wide network of trusted, the who is who, I call it, of the Greek economy is who we represent as members. And of course, the biggest US multinationals that give it an extra stamp of approval that we're doing something right here for US investors. So with our US partners here, we are putting together programs, initiatives, reports, engagements that promote and tailor-made events for our members as well to raise awareness about their work in the States, but also in Greece. And so this is one aspect of our work. The second one, the one that we can offer our Greek members, is to facilitate their entry into the US market through connections, to trusted partners that we have here, to introductions to officials and policymakers and our partners from the US Chamber of Commerce, to the state offices, development offices. This is all something that we can provide, and also facilitate with market entry, depending on what their preferred strategy is, and even develop business plans for them, again, in partnership with our trusted partners in the US. So this is all services that we can provide. At the same time, of course, we have a little bit, we take the pulse of what US investors are interested in and provide feedback to our head office, of course, in Athens, and also to stakeholders at the embassy. I mean, with Dionysi, we work very well together here, and it's a pleasure and actually a fortunate event to have you in Washington at this time. So we are working together to basically communicate in real time almost what the considerations, the priorities, the concerns of our stakeholders and our members here are. Let me, and I would like to just say one more thing on the Greek companies that have a presence in the US, because this is good for them, right? A business decision that makes sense for them, especially at the time of tariffs. This is also something that might help alleviate some of the effects of the high tariffs if you have a production facility, of course, in the US. But at the same time, you take advantage of the vast resources of the US market, which is still the biggest and most dynamic in the world. Politics aside, as Dionysis mentioned earlier, different states have different incentives and different priorities, including green investment and green energy. So this is all up for grabs for Greek companies. And the way I see it, this also feeds back to Greece, especially given our diaspora and the good people-to-people ties and the key sectors where our strategic interests with the US government align, to basically bring back value added to the Greek economy. And this is something that has been happening through these companies that invest here and form partnerships with US partners. but also in technology cooperation, in growing and diversifying, importantly, the Greek economy as well, and making it more extrovert.
Thank you very much, both of you, by the way. I think we are closing this session with a very encouraging message that our bilateral relations, they haven't reached at all, the roof. And we have a quite long road, let's say, still. And this is very optimistic. And I hope, both companies, both the American companies, can take advantage of Greece, the services and the location, actually, of our country, and that we are part of the single market as well. This is another advantage that we have. And at the same time, of course, Greek companies can really take advantage of the U.S., let's say, incentives in establishing a presence there. I thank you, both of you. And of course, I ask you to remain, connected in case there will be some questions after, the last session that we're moving right now to. Thank you very much. So we are moving to the final today's discussion, focusing on practical actions, reforms, and future opportunities. And I will ask, the president of AmCham of the American Hellenic Chamber of Commerce, John Sarakakis, to moderate the concluding session. President Sarakakis.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I will switch to Greek since our next guests are Greek. Και πραγματικά παρακολουθώ τη συζήτηση για πάνω από μία ώρα και τη βρίσκω εξαιρετικά ενδιαφέρουσα και πολύ ζωντανή και νομίζω είναι καλή στιγμή για να περάσουμε στο επόμενο στάδιο της κουβέντας μας και να μιλήσουμε λίγο πιο πρακτικά για το πώς η Ελλάδα μπορεί να αξιοποιήσει τη δυναμική της διατλαντικής οικονομίας, όπως την περιέγραψαν πολύ ωραία οι προηγούμενοι ομιλητές και επειδή ως επιμελητήριο πάντα μας ενδιαφέρει πώς η Ελλάδα και η ελληνική οικονομία μπορεί να ενισχύσει την ανταγωνιστικότητά της, να προσελκύσει περισσότερες στρατηγικές επενδύσεις και ειδικά αμερικανικές και να αποκτήσει ένα ακόμα πιο ουσιαστικό ρόλο στις ευρωατλαντικές αλυσίδες εφοδιασμού και συνεργασίας. Για να συζητήσουμε αυτά, έχω την πολύ μεγάλη χαρά να καλωσορίσω απόψε τον κύριο Άκη Σκλάβο, Γενικό Διευθυντή Προώθησης Επενδύσεων της Enterprise Greece και τον καθηγητή Νίκο Βέτα, Γενικό Διευθυντή του Ιδρύματος Οικονομικών και Βιομηχανικών Ερευνών. Σας καλωσορίζω και τους δύο και θα ήθελα να περάσουμε κατευθείαν στην πρώτη ερώτηση. Προς τον κύριο Βέτα θα τη θέσω αυτή. Η Ελλάδα συχνά περιγράφεται ως strategic hub, gateway για την νότιο-ανατολική Ευρώπη και την Ανατολική Μεσόγειο. Αυτή βεβαίως είναι πολύ, έτσι, ίσως και λίγο βαρύγδουποι χαρακτηρισμοί, πλην όμως υποκρίνουν προφανώς μια οικονομική πραγματικότητα που είναι αδιαμφισβήτητη. Θέλετε να μας πείτε τι χρειάζεται κατά τη γνώμη σας να γίνει ώστε αυτό να αποτυπωθεί και ουσιαστικά σε πραγματικές επενδύσεις, σε παραγωγή, σε εξαγωγές και βεβαίως, όπως προανέφερα, και σε μεγαλύτερη συμμετοχή της ελληνικής οικονομίας στις αμερικανικές αλλά και τις ευρωπαϊκές αλυσίδες εφοδιασμού. Κύριε Βέτα.
Να ξεκινήσω ευχαριστώντας για την φιλοξενία. Η ημερίδα σας είναι πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα ως τώρα και ελπίζω ότι θα κάνουμε και μια ενδιαφέρουσα συζήτηση. Πριν δούμε το τι μπορεί να χρειάζεται από εδώ και πέρα, είναι φυσικά σημαντικό να δούμε προσεκτικά την κατάσταση. Είναι η Ελλάδα σήμερα αυτό το οποίο είπατε, ένα κέντρο της περιοχής ή όπως και εσείς ο ίδιος το είπατε, μήπως αυτό είναι λίγο βαρύγδουπο. Νομίζω η ζυγαριά προς το παρόν κλείνει λίγο προς το δεύτερο. Η Ελλάδα προσπάθησε να γίνει ένα κέντρο της περιοχής και όσον αφορά τα χρηματοπιστωτικά και όσον αφορά την καθ' αυτό παραγωγική διαδικασία και ευρύτερα. Τα χρόνια στα οποία η ίδια μπήκε στο ευρώ, μιλάω για τα χρόνια περίπου από το 2000 μέχρι το 2008, με επέκταση στα Βαλκάνια, στην Τουρκία, καλύτερη διασύνδεση επενδυτικά και εμπορικά με όλη την Ευρώπη. Αυτό όμως ανατράπηκε με την κρίση. Και στην κρίση, εκτός όλων των άλλων, κλειστήκαμε στο καβούκι μας, με μία μικρή εξαίρεση, στην οποία θα επανέλθω. Σίγουρα κλειστήκαμε στο καβούκι μας χρηματοπιστωτικά, δεν υπήρχαν ροές προς τη χώρα. Η μικρή εξαίρεση είναι επιχειρήσεις οι οποίες ήταν στις μεταποιητικής βιομηχανίας ή όταν ξεκίνησαν ήταν απλώς και επιχειρήσεις τεχνολογίας, οι οποίες διέγνωσαν σωστά ότι δεν θα είχαν κανένα μέλλον εάν ο προσανατολισμός τους ήταν εγχώριος. Χρησιμοποίησαν και ως βάση το γεγονός ότι οι μισθοί στη χώρα έπεσαν πάρα πολύ, αλλά κυρίως χρησιμοποίησαν το γεγονός ότι το ανθρώπινο κεφάλαιο το δικό τους ήταν υψηλό. Και αυτές οι επιχειρήσεις που για να το οπτικοποιήσουμε μπορεί να ξεκίνησαν από 10, 20 ή 70 άτομα, πολλαπλασίασαν τη λειτουργία τους και την απασχόληση που έδιναν επί 10 φορές, επί 20 φορές. Και αυτές είναι επιχειρήσεις οι οποίες σήμερα μπορεί να απασχολούν 200, 300, 400, 500 άτομα. Με τα διεθνή μέτρα μεγέθους είναι επιχειρήσεις, θα μου επιτρέψετε κύριε Σαρακάκη την έκφραση, είναι λίγο μπουτίκ, αλλά για την ελληνική οικονομία είναι μεγάλες και απαραίτητες. Και η έννοια της μπουτίκ φέρνει και λίγο μία εξειδίκευση μαζί της. Είναι επιχειρήσεις οι οποίες κατάφεραν να έχουν συγκριτικό πλεονέκτημα διότι ήταν αρκετά ευέλικτες και πολύ κοντά στον πελάτη. Και μπήκαν και σε αυτές τις περίφημες αλυσίδες αξίας, οι οποίες είναι παγκόσμιες. Είναι δύσκολο να πεις αν είναι αμερικάνικες, αν είναι ευρωπαϊκές. Άλλωστε, οι πιο σημαντικές αμερικάνικες επιχειρήσεις, και στη συζήτηση που κάνουμε για τις σχέσεις ανάμεσα στις δύο οικονομίες, αυτό είναι σημαντικό, οι περισσότερες αμερικάνικες επιχειρήσεις είναι και πολυεθνικές επιχειρήσεις. Δεν λειτουργούν ως αμερικάνικες αμιγώς. Αυτό είναι μια πολύ καλή μαγιά, η οποία όμως δεν έχει ανατρέψει την μεγάλη εικόνα. Παρεπτόντως πάνω σε αυτή τη μαγιά χτίστηκε η θετική πορεία των ελληνικών εξαγωγών προϊόντος, που τα τελευταία 10 χρόνια είναι σχεδόν αδιάλειπτη. Έχουμε πολύ περισσότερες εξαγωγές προϊόντων όλων των ειδών, έτσι, από τρόφιμα και φάρμακα μέχρι μέταλλα και ιδίως επεξεργασμένα, διάφορα προϊόντα. Αυτά αυξάνονται, είναι πάρα πολύ σημαντικό αυτό. Αυτό μπορεί να λειτουργήσει, αλλά έχει ένα συγκεκριμένο αιμοδότη. Οι ελληνικές επιχειρήσεις δεν μπορούν αυτές να συνεχίσουν, να κάνουν αυτό και να το πολλαπλασιάσουν επί 5 φορές, επί 10 φορές, που είναι το ζητούμενο. Και είναι αυτό το οποίο συνέβη σε άλλες οικονομίες που βγήκαν από βαθιές κρίσεις. Για όσους δεν έχουν τέτοια γνώση ή μνήμη, η οικονομία της Νότιας Κορέας που τα τελευταία χρόνια είναι αντικείμενο θαυμασμού, ήταν μια οικονομία που πριν από 2,5 δεκαετίες μπήκε και αυτή σε ένα πρόγραμμα του Διεθνούς Νομισματικού Ταμείου. Δεν είχαν μαντήλι να κλάψουν οι άνθρωποι και τελικά αυτή τη στιγμή έχει 10 παγκόσμια αναγνωρίσιμα brands, από εξειδικευμένα electronics μέχρι ναυπήγηση. Μεγαλύτερη βέβαια οικονομία από μας, αλλά βάζω ένα πύχη φιλοδοξίας και για μας, γιατί μέρος και της λύσης ήταν η διασύνδεση με ξένη τεχνολογία και ιδίως και με αμερικάνικη τεχνολογία. Να κλείσω λίγο για να μην μακρηγορήσω περισσότερο από ό,τι πρέπει. Είπα ότι υπάρχει μια συγκεκριμένη συνθήκη για να μπορεί αυτό να συνεχιστεί. Και η συνθήκη έχει να κάνει με την εξειδίκευση του ανθρώπινου δυναμικού, άρα την διαχείριση της γνώσης στους ανθρώπους από τα πρώτα χρόνια της ζωής τους μέχρι μεταπτυχιακά και έρευνα, και όχι μόνο Ελλήνων, αλλά ανθρώπων που θα έρθουν από όλη την περιοχή, ενδεχόμενα να σπουδάσουν στη χώρα και θα μείνουν στη χώρα, ενδεχόμενα να ζήσουν ως ψηφιακοί νομάδες ή ως στελέχη επιχειρήσεων. Αυτό η χώρα το χρειάζεται. Υπάρχει ένα δεύτερο που είναι σημαντικό, το λέω επιγραμματικά, μπορεί να ξανάρθουμε σε αυτό αν το θέλετε, έχει να κάνει με όλη τη διασύνδεση του πλέγματος, πολιτισμός, ιστορία και το κέντρο μιας γεωγραφικής περιοχής, η οποία έχει ένα παγκόσμιο βάρος. Και η χώρα μπορεί να προσφέρει, αλλά και να πάρει σημαντική αξία με βάση αυτή την ιστορία και τον πολιτισμό. Είναι ένα τεράστιο αγαθό που έχουμε και θέλει περαιτέρω ανάπτυξη και θα μας ξεχωρίσει.
Μάλιστα, πολύ, πολύ ενδιαφέρον αυτό. Θα επανέλθουμε στο θέμα του πολιτισμού και της ιστορίας. Θα ήθελα πρώτα όμως να ρωτήσω τον κύριο Σκλάβο, ο οποίος εργάζεται στην προσέλκυση των επενδύσεων, να μας πει και εκείνος, εκτός από τα εμπόδια, τα μακροχρόνια μάλλον προβλήματα που ίσως έχει κληθεί να αντιμετωπίσει η ελληνική οικονομία, αν μπορείτε κι εσείς να εντοπίσετε πιο πρακτικά προβλήματα που δυστυχώς αντιμετωπίζουν οι ξένοι επενδυτές στην Ελλάδα. Βέβαια, για να είμαστε ειλικρινείς, δεν είναι η Ελλάδα, δεν έχει το αποκλειστικό προνόμιο εντός εισαγωγικών να αντιμετωπίζει θέματα γραφειοκρατίας, αλλά όμως παραμένει, παρά τις μεταρρυθμιστικές προσπάθειες, ένα θέμα που απασχολεί και επιβραδύνει τις επενδύσεις. Αδειοδοτική διαδικασία, γραφειοκρατία, τα χωροταξικά, νομική αβεβαιότητα και η γνωστή καθυστέρηση στην απονομή της δικαιοσύνης, οι ενδεχομένως ελλειπείς υποδομές. Θέλετε λίγο να σχολιάσετε πάνω σε αυτά, σας παρακαλώ.
Καλησπέρα και σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ για την πρόσκληση στην ημερίδα σας. Νομίζω ότι θα πρέπει να εστιάσω στα δύο τα οποία είναι τα βασικότερα και αυτά τα οποία δημιουργούν τις περισσότερες καθυστερήσεις ή κάνουν τους επενδυτές στο τέλος να αποσύρουν την επενδυτική τους επιλογή προς την Ελλάδα. Το πρώτο έχει να κάνει με την αδειοδότηση, η οποία έχει δύο βασικά σκέλη. Το ένα είναι η αργοπορία στις διοικητικές διαδικασίες και το δεύτερο είναι το περίπλοκο, αν μπορώ να το ονομάσω έτσι, χωροταξικό, πολεοδομικό και περιβαλλοντικό θεσμικό πλαίσιο. Όλα αυτά βέβαια έχουν να κάνουν κυρίως με greenfield investments. Τώρα, και το δεύτερο σημαντικό και η δεύτερη σημαντική προβληματική των ξένων επενδυτών έχει να κάνει με το σύστημα της απονομής της δικαιοσύνης. Αν ξεκινήσουμε από το πρώτο, το οποίο έχει να κάνει με την αδειοδότηση, την χωροταξία, την πολεοδομία και το περιβάλλον, πράγματι υπήρχαν πάρα πολύ μεγάλες καθυστερήσεις στο παρελθόν και συνεχίζουν να υπάρχουν και σήμερα καθυστερήσεις. Πρέπει να εστιάσουμε σε δύο σημαντικά θέματα. Το πρώτο έχει να κάνει με την αλλαγή του θεσμικού πλαισίου, έτσι ώστε πλέον να υπάρχουν χωροταξικοπολεοδομικά εργαλεία, τα οποία να μπορούν να υποδεχτούν μεγάλου τύπου και ιδιαίτερης πολυπλοκότητας επενδύσεις. Τέτοια είναι τα ΕΣΚΑΣΕ, τα ειδικά σχέδια χωρικής ανάπτυξης στρατηγικών επενδύσεων και τα ειδικά πολεοδομικά σχέδια. Άρα, μεγάλες επενδύσεις είτε στη βιομηχανία, είτε στην ενέργεια, είτε στον τουρισμό, οι οποίες ήταν αδύνατον να προχωρήσουν μέχρι το 2008-2009, πλέον έχουν εργαλεία τα οποία είναι και αυτά αργά πολλές φορές και χρειάζονται και 2 και 3 χρόνια για να ολοκληρώσουν τις αδειοδοτικές διαδικασίες, αλλά υπάρχουν και πλέον μεγάλου large-scale investments μπορούν πλέον να αναπτυχθούν στην χώρα μας. Το δεύτερο, το οποίο θα πρέπει να σημειώσω, είναι ότι εδώ και τουλάχιστον 3-4 χρόνια η χώρα βρίσκεται σε μια αναδιάταξη του θεσμικού πλαισίου που έχει να κάνει με την χωροταξία, την πολεοδομία και το περιβάλλον. Έτσι, αν λάβουμε υπόψη τη χωροταξία, αυτό που συμβαίνει είναι να εκδίδονται πλέον νέα χωροταξικά δεδομένα σε όλα τα επίπεδα, από το ειδικό χωροταξικό τουρισμού, το οποίο είδαμε να εκδίδεται πλέον και οικία πριν από μερικές μέρες, το ειδικό χωροταξικό για τις ΑΠΕ, το οποίο βρίσκεται και αυτό σε μεταβολή, την δημιουργία κατώτερου πολεοδομικού σχεδιασμού, ο οποίος έχει να κάνει με τα περιφερειακά χωροταξικά, τα οποία έχουν ολοκληρωθεί, και πλέον του κατώτερου σχεδιασμού, ο οποίος έχει να κάνει με τα τοπικά πολεοδομικά σχέδια. Την ίδια στιγμή, όλες οι περιοχές Natura, οι οποίες αποτελούν το 25 με 30% της χώρας, έτσι, της θαλάσσιας και της χερσαίας επιφάνειας της χώρας, πλέον ζωνοποιούνται και θεσμοθετούνται. Πλέον έχουμε κτηματολόγιο, πλέον έχουμε δασικούς χάρτες, πλέον έχουμε αρχαιολογικούς χάρτες, πλέον έχουμε προγραφή του Αιγιαλού. Βρισκόμαστε λοιπόν σε μια κατάσταση όπου συντελείται μια μεγάλη αλλαγή, η οποία δεν έχει ακόμα οριστικοποιηθεί και αυτή συνεχίζει να φέρνει καθυστερήσεις στην χωροταξικοπολεοδομία. Εκτιμώ ότι σε τα επόμενα 2 χρόνια όλα θα είναι τακτοποιημένα και πλέον πάρα πολύ ξεκάθαρα κάποιος θα μπορεί να προσδιορίζει ένα γεωτεμάχιο ή ένα οικόπεδο ανά την Ελλάδα και θα ξέρει ξεκάθαρα τι θα μπορεί να γίνεται. Μέχρι τότε θα συνεχίσουμε να έχουμε κάποια θέματα. Τώρα, πηγαίνοντας στο δεύτερο κομμάτι, το οποίο έχει να κάνει με την απόδοση δικαιοσύνης όσον αφορά εταιρικά θέματα επενδύσεων και διοικητικά θέματα, τα οποία είναι αυτά τα οποία ταλαιπωρούν τους επενδυτές. Πράγματι, οι καθυστερήσεις ήταν τεράστιες. Στα διοικητικά δικαστήρια μπορούσες να καθίσεις μέχρι και 5 και 6 και 7 χρόνια προκειμένου να τελεσιδικήσει μία διένεξη, είτε είναι μεταξύ ιδιωτών, είτε είναι μεταξύ ιδιωτών και του κράτους. Γίνεται μία και εκεί πέρα πολύ μεγάλη προσπάθεια. Ήδη έχει καταρτιστεί ο νέος δικαστικός χάρτης, οπότε γίνεται καλύτερη κατανομή των δικαστικών υποθέσεων. Έχουμε μείωση των υποστελεχωμένων και των ενεργών δικαστηρίων και ήδη παρατηρείται μια απομείωση του χρόνου εκδίκασης των υποθέσεων κατά 50% τον τελευταίο 1 χρόνο. Αυτή η αλλαγή έχει γίνει μέσα στο 24, η θεσμική. Έχουμε την ψηφιοποίηση των διαδικασιών, έτσι, ηλεκτρονική κατάθεση δικογράφων, ψηφιακή παρακολούθηση της πορείας των υποθέσεων κτλ. Πολύ σημαντικό, έχουμε αλλαγή στους κώδικες πολιτικής και ποινικής δικονομίας. Έτσι, καταφέρνουμε να περιορίσουμε τις συνεχείς αναβολές, τις οποίες τις έχουμε ζήσει όλοι στα δικαστήρια, αυστηροποιούνται οι προθεσμίες και έχουμε και επιτάχυνση τελικά της έκδοσης των διαδικασιών. Όλα αυτά, επί της ουσίας, είναι θεσμικές αλλαγές, οι οποίες έχουν συντελεστεί στο νομοθετικό πλαίσιο, αλλά αυτή τη στιγμή βρισκόμαστε on the process να λάβουν χώρο και στην πραγματική day-to-day αντιμετώπιση των πραγμάτων. Είναι κάτι που και αυτό θα πάρει χρόνο, αλλά εκτιμάω ότι και αυτή η κατάσταση αρχίζει να βελτιώνεται. Κατά την εκτίμησή μας, αυτοί είναι οι 2 παράγοντες οι οποίοι είναι οι σημαντικότεροι. Υπάρχουν και άλλοι παράγοντες, όπως είναι το θέμα των υποδομών, άρα θα πρέπει ο επενδυτής πάρα πολύ καλά στο due diligence να λαμβάνει υπόψη του τις υποδομές που υπάρχουν σε κάθε περιοχή όπου πάει να εγκαταστήσει την επένδυσή τους. Υπάρχουν περιορισμοί στο τραπεζικό μας σύστημα. Φυσικά και έχει αρχίσει και λειτουργεί πάρα πολύ καλύτερα. Υπήρχε το RRF, το Ταμείο Ανάκαμψης, το οποίο βοήθησε πολλά και μεγάλα projects να προχωρήσουν, αλλά ακόμα χρειάζεται επέκταση της πιστωτικής πολιτικής και εδώ πέρα έρχονται τα ξένα κεφάλαια και οι ξένες τράπεζες, οι αμερικάνικες, οι οποίες θα μπορούσαν σε joint ventures και σε consortium βοηθούν στην χρηματοδότηση επενδυτικών σχεδίων στην χώρα μας.
Πολύ ωραία. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Θα σας ρωτήσω αργότερα για τις λύσεις που προτίθεστε μάλλον τις διευκολύνσεις που θα παρέξετε. Κύριε Βέτα, ο κύριος Σκλάβος μίλησε για μεγάλες και εμβληματικές επενδύσεις και καλώς το Enterprise Greece ασχολείται με αυτές. Πλην όμως μια οικονομία δεν μπορεί να βασίζεται μόνο σε αυτές, αλλά χρειάζεται και η ζωή κεφαλαίων σε μικρότερες, πιο καθημερινές, ας μου επιτραπεί η έκφραση, επενδύσεις, πιο κοινές και ενδεχομένως αυτές που είναι και που θα είχαν και μεγαλύτερο ενδιαφέρον για την ελληνική κοινότητα στην Αμερική, για παράδειγμα. Εσείς τι προβλήματα βλέπετε να έχει η χώρα για την προσέλκυση αυτών των μικρότερων επενδύσεων? Και καταρχάς να μας πείτε και αν τις θεωρείτε σημαντικές, δηλαδή αν χρειαζόμαστε πολλές μικρές ή λίγες μεγάλες.
Δεν είμαι επιχειρηματίας, είμαι οικονομολόγος. Και ως οικονομολόγος γνωρίζω ότι χρειάζεται μια διαφοροποιημένη προσέγγιση πολλές φορές στο πεδίο της παραγωγής. Μικρή κλίμακα και στοχευμένη επένδυση είναι άλλες φορές το κατάλληλο. Μερικές άλλες φορές, αν δεν πετύχεις μεγάλη κλίμακα, δεν μπορείς να ανταγωνιστείς. Στη χώρα μας υπάρχει πρόβλημα, νομίζω, υπάρχει υστέρηση, για να μην αυτομαστιγωνόμαστε. Υπάρχει υστέρηση και στα δύο. Το επίπεδο των επενδύσεων σήμερα είναι χαμηλότερο από αυτό το οποίο εμείς οι ίδιοι βάζαμε σαν στόχο και πριν από μερικά χρόνια. Σε μία μελέτη πριν από 2-3 μέρες υπολογίσαμε ότι το απόθεμα κεφαλαίου που δεν έχει αποσβεστεί, αυτό είναι ουσιαστικά οι επενδύσεις που γίνανε τα προηγούμενα χρόνια και ακόμη έχουν μια παραγωγική ζωή. Εάν το κατανείμεις στους εργαζόμενους της χώρας, ουσιαστικά είναι με πόσο κεφάλαιο ενδυναμώνεις κάθε εργαζόμενο να δουλέψει. Στον μέσο όρο της χώρας αυτό έφθινε μέχρι και πέρσι. Μόλις πέρσι σταθεροποιήθηκε και ελπίζουμε ότι από φέτος θα αρχίσει να ανεβαίνει. Και η απόσταση από μια μέση ευρωπαϊκή οικονομία είναι πολύ μεγάλη. Ανάλογα με τον κλάδο είμαστε στο μισό ή και στο 1/3 του επενδεδημένου κεφαλαίου. Άρα, ενώ είναι πάρα πολύ σημαντικά και ευίωνα αυτά τα οποία περιέγραψε πριν ο κύριος Κλάβος, η απόσταση που έχουμε να καλύψουμε είναι πάρα πολύ μεγάλη. Εάν βέβαια ο επιθυμητός σκοπός είναι υψηλή ευημερία. Αν ο σκοπός είναι μία γραμμική επέκταση αυτού που έχουμε σήμερα, αυτό μπορεί να επιτευχθεί χωρίς μεγαλύτερες τομές. Ο καθένας σας διαλέξει. Τώρα, στο τι κανείς μπορεί να πει στα επιμέρους. Γιατί ρωτήσατε γιατί μπορεί να έχουμε κάποια τέτοια υστέρηση. Εντάξει, υπάρχει κάτι το οποίο δεν μπορούμε να τα αλλάξουμε, είναι το μέγεθος της εσωτερικής αγοράς. Με αυτή την έννοια όμως, η κύρια φύση των επενδύσεων πρέπει να είναι επενδύσεις οι οποίες να έχουν και εξαγωγικό χαρακτήρα. Παρεπιπτόντως αυτό θα ευνοήσει και τους Έλληνες καταναλωτές, γιατί όταν κάνεις μία επένδυση, αυτή εξυπηρετεί και την εσωτερική αγορά κατά κανόνα, εντείνοντας τον ανταγωνισμό σε αυτήν. Συνδυάζεται όμως με αυτό που ρωτήσατε πιο πριν. Μπορούμε να είμαστε ένα κέντρο της περιοχής.
Ναι.
Ένα κέντρο στο οποίο άνθρωποι από τη Βόρεια Αφρική, από τη Μέση Ανατολή, από τα Βαλκάνια, από την ευρύτερη Ευρώπη θα έρθουν εδώ να σπουδάσουν, να δημιουργήσουν τεχνολογία, να φτιάξουν επιχειρήσεις νεοφυείς ενδεχόμενα ή να ξεκινήσουν μια καριέρα σε μια θυγατρική μεγάλης επιχείρησης. Ακόμη δεν μπορούμε να κάνουμε πιστικά αυτό το case. Είμαστε πολύ καλύτερα από ό,τι ήμασταν πριν από 5 ή 10 χρόνια, αλλά πρέπει κανείς να δοκιμάσει πολύ να πείσει κάποιον γιατί θα έρθει στην Ελλάδα και δεν θα πάει σήμερα στην Ισπανία ή δεν θα πάει στην Τουρκία για άλλους λόγους, κόστους, ή δεν θα πάει στην Πολωνία, η οποία έχει και μια εσωτερική αγορά. Καθόλου δεν λέω ότι είμαστε χαμένη υπόθεση, περιγράφω όμως τον δρόμο που πρέπει να καλύψουμε. Και για να συνδυαστεί αυτό με τα μέτρα πολιτικής που περιέγραψε πριν ο κύριος Κλάβος και από το δικό του οργανισμό, αλλά ευρύτερα από την κυβέρνηση, να το πω, αν μου επιτρέπετε, λίγο σχηματικά, ο επενδυτής ο οποίος θα έρθει στην Ελλάδα θα το κάνει με προθυμία και τρέχοντας, μόνο εάν φτάσουμε στο σημείο να μην σκέφτεται ποια θα είναι η επόμενη κυβέρνηση και αν η επόμενη κυβέρνηση θα αλλάξει σημαντικά τους όρους του παιχνιδιού. Γιατί ένας νόμος αλλάζει με νόμο.
Ναι.
Και ο τρόπος να μην αλλάζουν οι νόμοι επιταχύρω για όσους θέλουν να έρθουν στην Ελλάδα και να δημιουργήσουν παραγωγή και εργασία, γιατί αυτό μας ενδιαφέρει εν τέλει, είναι να υπάρξουν ευρύτερες συνενέσεις για τέτοιου είδους στόχους. Την προσέλκυση ξένου κεφαλαίου, ειδικότερα εκεί που θα δημιουργήσει θέσεις εργασίας υψηλής αξίας, την υποστήριξη της εγχώριας αποταμιεύσης, που είναι εξίσου σημαντικό, τη διευκόλυνση ελληνικών επιχειρήσεων να εξάγουν, την διευκόλυνση ελληνικών επιχειρήσεων να γίνουν τελικά πολυεθνικές. Εάν αυτό το δούμε σαν έναν εθνικό στόχο πάνω στον οποίο κάθεται το εθνικό εισόδημα και η κοινωνική συνοχή και η κοινωνική κοινοτικότητα, να μου επιτρέψετε να πω, αυτό είναι μιας άλλης τάξης πρόβλημα από το να πούμε ότι στον εκλογικό της κύκλο μια κυβέρνηση κάνει 2, 3 ή 200 νομοθετήματα, τα οποία όμως μπορεί εν τέλει να αλλάξουν. Αυτό το οποίο, εάν ένας τυχαίος επενδυτής σκεφτεί να πάω σήμερα στην Ισπανία ή να πάω σήμερα στην Ελλάδα, και αναφέρω μια χώρα η οποία δεν έχει τουλάχιστον με την επιφανειακή έννοια μεγαλύτερη πολιτική σταθερότητα. Έχουν ασταθείς κυβερνήσεις, προσπαθούν να βρουν συνεργασίες. Παρόλα αυτά υπάρχει μια βάση σιγουριάς για το πώς λίγο πολύ θα είναι αυτή η χώρα και αυτή η οικονομία και σε 5 χρόνια και σε 10 χρόνια που δεν θα ανατραπεί. Ένα πλαίσιο που λέει σιγά σιγά μειώνουμε το χρέος είναι σημαντικό. Από πού θα έχουμε φορολογικά έσοδα στο μέλλον, όχι μόνο από την μισθωτή εργασία, κατά κύριο λόγο, αυτό θα είναι λάθος. Η στροφή του παραγωγικού υποδείγματος προς εξωστρεφείς και καινοτόμες, αυτού του είδους, μια τέτοιου είδους, αν μου επιτρέψετε, πλατφόρμα που δεν είναι μόνο στενά οικονομική, αλλά έχει και κοινωνικές και πολιτικές άκρες, είναι κάτι το οποίο μπορεί να κάνει την Ελλάδα να μην προσπαθεί σιγά σιγά να φύγει από αυτό στο οποίο έχει βρεθεί μετά την κρίση, που είναι τα τελευταία σκαλοπάτια των κατανομών, και πραγματικά να γίνει μια πολύ ισχυρή οικονομία σε πολλά πράγματα, μην πηγαίνοντας με το ευρωπαϊκό εγχειρίδιο. Τι εννοώ με αυτό? Αυτό σχετίζεται λίγο και με την Αμερική και με ωφέλη που μπορεί να έχει η ελληνική οικονομία αν διασυνδεθεί στενότερα με εκείνη την οικονομία. Η Ευρώπη έχει πάρα πολλά θετικά, αλλά έχει και η ίδια κουσούρια. Ένα από τα οποία είναι οι αργές διαδικασίες, οι πολυνομίες. Σε αυτό θα μπορούσαμε να προσομοιάσουμε σε οικονομίες οι οποίες τρέχουν πολύ πιο γρήγορα από τη μέση ευρωπαϊκή οικονομία, ώστε να μπορέσουμε να φτάσουμε και στο επίπεδο ευημερίας, και προς αυτό έχουμε δεξαμενές. Υπάρχει διασύνδεση με την ναυτιλία, η οποία δεν κινείται εντός των συνόρων, άρα μπορεί να δώσει και να πάρει. Υπάρχει διασύνδεση με την ομογένεια, η οποία έχει και υψηλή εξειδίκευση επιστημονική, τουλάχιστον οι πιο πρόσφατες γενιές. Υπάρχει τέλος η γεωγραφική περιοχή, όπως είπαμε. Άρα προσπαθώ να δημιουργήσω, να σκεφτώ ένα πλαίσιο, το οποίο εάν εμπεδοθεί η σταθερότητα ως προς τους κανόνες, μαζί βέβαια με τη δημοσιονομική, θα είναι πολύ δύσκολο για κάποιον επενδυτή να ξεπεράσει εύκολα την πρόσκληση της Ελλάδας, να πατήσει σε ένα χώρο ο οποίος θα είναι σταθερός. Θα υπάρχει ένα ελάχιστο συνεννόησης όσον αφορά του πώς γίνεται το επιχειρήν. Μέσα σε αυτό μπαίνουν όλα τα επιμέρους που είπε ο κύριος Κλάβος, είναι πάρα πολύ σημαντικά, από τη δικαιοσύνη μέχρι οτιδήποτε. Αυτή είναι μια νέα σελίδα της ελληνικής οικονομίας, η οποία βέβαια, για να πω και κάτι λίγο που έχει και μια αιχμή, δεν γίνεται χωρίς να ταράξεις τα ύδατα και να ξεβολέψεις και κάποιους, γιατί υπάρχουν υπάρχει και επιχειρηματική πρόσοδος, η οποία βγαίνει στη χώρα μόνο και μόνο λόγω των στρεβλώσεων που υπάρχουν. Αυτό θα πρέπει να υποβιβαστεί προς όφελος κάποιου καλύτερου.
Ναι. Ωραία. Το επιμελητήριο διαχρονικά προσπαθεί πάντα να ευαγγελίζει την πρόοδο, την ευημερία που αναφέρεται προηγουμένως, προς όφελος όσο γίνεται όλης της κοινωνίας και της οικονομίας και βεβαίως να προωθούμε την επιχειρηματικότητα που πιστεύουμε ότι είναι ο μόνος τρόπος για την πρόοδο και την ανάπτυξη. Αναφέρεται ότι η Ελλάδα αποκλίνει πάρα πολύ συγκρινόμενη με τις άλλες ευρωπαϊκές χώρες ως προς την προσέλκυση των επενδύσεων και ο κύριος Κλάβος θα ήθελε να μας πει τα κίνητρα που σήμερα προσφέρει η Ελλάδα, πολλά από τα οποία από τις συζητήσεις μας και μέσω του γραφείου της Ουάσιγκτον στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες δεν είναι ίσως πάρα πολύ γνωστά. Το πλήθος και το εύρος των κινήτρων που υπάρχουν. Οπότε θα ήθελα να τα πει σήμερα ο κύριος Κλάβος για να τα ακούσουν όσοι παρακολουθούν και επίσης να μας πει και πώς μετράει ο ίδιος την επιτυχία. Πώς θα θεωρούσατε μια πετυχημένη εξέλιξη της πρόθεσης των επενδύσεων. Μετράτε την αύξηση των εισαγωγών, τα κεφάλαια που ζουν στην οικονομία, τις νέες θέσεις που δημιουργούνται. Ποιους δείκτες έχετε για να πείτε ότι για να μπορέσετε να αξιολογήσετε και να μετρήσετε το ποσοστό της επιτυχίας των προσπαθειών σας.
Θα ήθελα να ξεκινήσω από κάτι που είναι πάρα πολύ τετριμένο και έχει ακουστεί πάρα πολύ και στο δικό σας το πάνελ, την γεωπολιτική θέση. Θα ήθελα όμως να την προσεγγίσω από την εξής οπτική γωνία. Ότι πλέον εισερχόμαστε σε μια εποχή όπου η οικονομία, η ασφάλεια και η βιομηχανική παραγωγή συνδέονται όλο και περισσότερο μεταξύ τους. Και η αποδοτικότητα πια δεν καθορίζει πλέον την μακροχρόνια βιωσιμότητα. Άρα η ανθεκτικότητα και η ασφάλεια διαμορφώνουν πλέον ουσιαστικά τις επενδυτικές αποφάσεις. Και εδώ πέρα υπάρχει μια τεράστια στρατηγική ευκαιρία. Το διεθνές σύστημα αυτή τη στιγμή αναδιοργανώνει ταυτόχρονα και τις εφοδιαστικές αλυσίδες και την ενεργειακή αρχιτεκτονική, τη βιομηχανική πολιτική και την περιφερειακή συνδεσιμότητα. Και εδώ πέρα είναι η μεγάλη ευκαιρία για την Ελλάδα. Άρα έχουμε συνηθίσει ελληνοαμερικανικές συνεργασίες να μας φέρουν στο μυαλό το εμπόριο, την ναυτιλία, τον τουρισμό που έρχεται και τις αμυντικές προμήθειες, κυρίως από την Αμερική προς την Ελλάδα. Πλέον σήμερα η συνεργασία όλο και περισσότερο λαμβάνει χώρα στην τεχνητή νοημοσύνη, στις υποδομές cloud, στην ενεργειακή ασφάλεια, στις αμυντικές τεχνολογίες, στα οικοσυστήματα καινοτομίας και τα οικοσυστήματα δεδομένων. Άρα η Ελλάδα αυτή τη στιγμή έχει το παράθυρο της ευκαιρίας, δεν ξέρω αν θα τα καταφέρει, να μετατραπεί σε μια στρατηγική πλατφόρμα για την ενέργεια, τα logistics, τη τεχνολογία, τη βιομηχανική ανθεκτικότητα. Γύρω από αυτές τις βασικές παραμέτρους, όπου μεγάλες επενδύσεις ήδη έχουν αρχίσει να εδραιώνονται πάνω στην ελληνική γη, θα μπορούσαν να δημιουργηθούν οικοσυστήματα τα οποία να είναι ωφέλιμα και για τις δύο χώρες, και για τις επιχειρήσεις τις αμερικάνικες, οι οποίες μπορούν να συνεισφέρουν τεχνολογία, know-how και κεφάλαιο φυσικά, αλλά και για την Ελλάδα, η οποία έχει ένα πολύτιμο ανθρώπινο δυναμικό, το οποίο είναι χαμηλό σε κόστος, αλλά υψηλό σε εκπαιδευτικό επίπεδο και φυσικά σχεδόν στο 95% του αγγλόφωνο. Άρα είναι κάτι το οποίο δεν πρέπει να το παραγνωρίζουμε. Θα σας μιλήσω όμως και για κίνητρα με την κλασική τους έννοια. Πρώτα απ' όλα υπάρχουν σημαντικά κινητροδοτικά εργαλεία. Το βασικό είναι ο νόμος των στρατηγικών επενδύσεων, ο οποίος ίσως δεν είναι πολύ γνωστός στο ευρύτερο επενδυτικό κοινό. Ο νόμος των στρατηγικών επενδύσεων, πέρα από τα χωροταξικοπολεοδομικές διευκολύνσεις, όπου με προεδρικό διάταγμα μπορείς να διασφαλίσεις τις χρήσεις γης, πολεοδομικούς συντελεστές και λοιπούς συντελεστές ενός γεωτεμαχίου, ενός οικοπαίδου για μια μεγάλου εύρους επένδυση, είτε είναι βιομηχανική, είτε ενεργειακή, είτε είναι τουριστική, διαθέτει και κινητροδοτικά εργαλεία. Υπάρχει ένα πρόγραμμα εμβληματικών επενδύσεων, το οποίο ανεξάρτητα με το budget, μπορεί να είναι και ένα budget 1.000.000, 500.000, αλλά μπορεί να είναι και μεγάλα budgets, τα οποία να είναι των 100, των 150 εκατομμυρίων. Προσφέρει cash grants σε επενδύσεις οι οποίες έχουν μια ιδιαίτερη ποιοτική ή και ποσοτική co-impact στην εθνική, στην τοπική οικονομία. Ένα άλλο πρόγραμμα κάτω από τις στρατηγικές επενδύσεις είναι αυτό του R&D. Πάλι και εκεί πέρα για projects έως 40 εκατομμύρια ευρώ και με τη δυνατότητα έως 20 εκατομμύρια ευρώ να διατεθούν σε cash grants, μπορούν να επιδοτηθούν προγράμματα τα οποία έχουν να κάνουν σε R&D σε οποιοδήποτε τομέα. Από τη βιοτεχνολογία, τα applications, τα shipping applications, οτιδήποτε επιφέρει added value στην υφιστάμενη τεχνογνωσία. Και υπάρχει και ένα γενικό πρόγραμμα το οποίο προσφέρει φορολογικά κίνητρα, αλλά τα προσφέρει σε όλο το εύρος των δραστηριοτήτων. Άρα είτε είναι μια εμπορική επιχείρηση, είτε είναι μια βιομηχανική επιχείρηση ή οποιοδήποτε τύπο επιχείρηση, εκτός τις πολύ βασικές οι οποίες εξαιρεί ο Γενικός Απαλλακτικός Κανονισμός, δηλαδή εξόρυξη βασικά, μπορούν να πάρουν φορολογικά κίνητρα. Μετά υπάρχει ο αναπτυξιακός νόμος, ο οποίος έχει χαμηλότερα ceilings, αλλά και οι στρατηγικές επενδύσεις είναι και ανοιχτές 365 μέρες το χρόνο. Υπάρχει ο αναπτυξιακός νόμος, ο οποίος και αυτός κινητροδοτεί μέχρι ένα συγκεκριμένο ποσό. Υπάρχει καθεστώς αναπτυξιακού νόμου για μεγάλες επενδύσεις, για παραμεθόριες περιοχές, για την βιομηχανία. Και φυσικά υπάρχουν και προγράμματα R&D τα οποία ανοίγουν από την Γενική Γραμματεία Έρευνας και Τεχνολογίας σε τακτά χρονικά διαστήματα.
Όπως υποψιαζόμαστε, είναι όντως πάρα πολλά τα προγράμματα και τα κίνητρα που είναι σε ισχύ, και επειδή κοιτάω τον χρόνο και δυστυχώς τον έχουμε εξαντλήσει και ούτως άλλως δεν θα μπορέσει κανείς ακροατής να τα συγκρατήσει, θα ήθελα να προσκαλέσω τους φίλους που μας ακούν από το εξωτερικό, ειδικά την Ομογένεια, να έρθουν σε επαφή με το γραφείο του επιμελητηρίου στην Ουάσιγκτον. Το επιμελητήριο και το Enterprise Greece έχουμε πολύ καλή συνεργασία μακροχρόνια, όπου θα μπορούσαμε να φέρουμε τους υποψήφιους επενδυτές σε επαφή με το Enterprise Greece για να ενημερωθούν πιο εξειδικευμένα για τις δικές τους ανάγκες. Έχω πάρα πολλές ερωτήσεις ακόμα που δυστυχώς δεν προλαβαίνουμε να τις εξαντλήσουμε, οπότε σεβόμενος το όριο του χρόνου θα ήθελα να σας ευχαριστήσω και τους δύο πάρα πολύ για τη σημερινή παρέμβασή σας και να δώσω το λόγο στον κύριο Σπιρτούνια για να κλείσει το σημερινό event μας.
Ευχαριστώ, Πρόεδρε. As we conclude today's discussion, one message is clear. Transatlantic relations remain not only economically important, but strategically indispensable. The challenge ahead is not simply preserving these ties, but adopting and strengthening them for a rapidly changing global environment. At the same time, our bilateral relations with the US are all-time high. We have built a strong and enduring alliance that can expand further in the economic and trade part, since there is quite a roof to increase the bilateral trade and investments relation, but we need to make the necessary reforms that would create the attractive environment. Thank you to all our distinguished speakers, participants, and partners for contributing to such a thoughtful and timely discussion. I want to remind all that the report, the annual Transatlantic Economic Report, is uploaded on our website. You can visit and download it or read it from there. So again, thank you all and have a pleasant evening.